Well, Sheriff Joe Arpaio from Phoenix, Arizona has already set that example for all of us. The last count, I think he has about 5,000 on his posse. When I was sheriff, I had about 125. Our search and rescue, our entire team was all posse members, all volunteers, and they were excellent. And we can exercise, the sheriff can exercise his authority to call out volunteers however he wants, and he can save the citizens a lot of money in doing so. UN troops being in the United States, even for little exercises, even for an exercise is something we should all be very concerned about. We had them in Arizona back when I was sheriff, and they weren't in my county, but they were in a neighboring county, and we got pictures of them and asked why they were there, and they said they were there on a peacekeeping mission. Well, I thought we were already at peace in Arizona and the United States. Why do we need the UN? Let me tell you right now, this mentality and the propaganda that's going around that the counties are subject to the state legislature, and that the state legislature is subject to the federal government, and that the federal government somehow is subject to this national government called the United Nations. That is absolutely atrocious. It's stupid. It's not true. It's not there. The UN has no authority over the United States. They have no authority over your sheriff. They have no authority over you unless you give it to them. And the first thing we need to do is get our country's sovereignty back and kick the United Nations out or dissolve it. And we shouldn't be in the United Nations. The United Nations was first propagandized as a means for keeping peace throughout the world, and since they've been there, there's been more poverty, which they said they were going to stop, which is absurd, but there's been more wars under the tutelage of the United Nations than at any other time in the history of the world. I think the bottom line on FEMA during Katrina is a typical example of what you get when you turn things over to the Washington, D.C. New Orleans and the state of Louisiana should have been prepared and should not have depended on FEMA to do anything. And they did, and they all paid for it dearly. And we're in a dire situation if we think that FEMA is going to take care of us in this country. They don't have a good track record. Man, here's another bureaucracy of Washington, D.C. that doesn't have a good track record. The I.R.S. doesn't have one, the FBI doesn't have one. It just goes on and on and on, folks. So I think the warning from Ronald Reagan when he said that government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem, was so true, and we need to wake up to that. Well, the I.R.S. had a hearing before Congress in 1998 where Jennifer Long and other employees, current agents of the I.R.S., testified that the I.R.S. routinely fabricates evidence against citizens who they know could not adequately defend themselves, who couldn't afford to financially defend themselves against the I.R.S. So the end result is, through this criminal act, is that people would just pay the money. And so what happened to the I.R.S. after that? After solid proof was given to Congress, who is supposed to oversee the I.R.S., what did the I.R.S. do? Did they investigate? Did they fire anybody? Did they put anybody in jail for all these illegal and criminal acts? No, Congress said that we want I.R.S. offices open on Saturday, and we want the I.R.S. to be more user-friendly. That's like telling the mafia to be more user-friendly, except the mafia has a little more scruples than the I.R.S. Well, the EPA is mentioned in my case on page 15, and if you read Mack versus U.S., the EPA was ruled to be unconstitutional in the 1970s, and yet they have gotten more power since then. And I think that's a typical example, just like the ruling in my case of Mack versus U.S. That ruling has been ignored. And it says that state legislatures are not subject to federal direction, and that the states and the counties and local jurisdictions actually standing up to the federal government and preventing incursions from the federal government is one of the Constitution's, quote, structural protections of liberty, end quote. And it's all right there in the case. So the federal government doesn't have authority over us unless we give it to them. The Federal Reserve is probably the biggest mistake that our country has made, along with the I.R.S., but they kind of go together, hand in hand. They're one and the same. But the Federal Reserve is not federal. It's owned by private banks. There is no question that the Federal Reserve is owned by private banks. It's not federal. So how did we do that? Congress, you've got a lot of work to do. And yet, our representatives in Washington, D.C. pretend that it has something to do with the government and that it's all proper. It's not.